Hello and welcome to what is the first of this season's Roger Scruton Memorial Lectures. And it's our hope that these lectures will at some point cease to be memorial lectures and become an institution in Oxford, grade 1 listed lectures, as it were. And we're hoping, though, before we get to the point where these are an institution or a feature of the intellectual architecture of this great city of the mind, that we would spend some time while the memory of our teacher, of a scholar, of our friend is fresh, to take a moment and dedicate one of these lectures to his memory and to his legacy. And that's the meaning of the lecture and the conversation that will be had tonight following the lecture. Very quickly, I'm Jonathan Price. I'm in the law faculty here, but you'll find me on a daily basis at Pusey House and St. Cross College, where I'm the Barry Fellow of Pusey House and a Fellow of St. Cross College. We have two other speakers, one of whom you'll hear from when I'm in conversation with Douglas Murray, and that is Maurice Lord Glasman, Labour peer, philosopher, full stop. Not political, not philosopher, full stop. And when you're introduced to him and when you interact with him, I think you'll see that. And the founder of the Blue Labour movement, about which he's written a fine introduction to it, which I've learned attempts to combine conservatism and socialism, things which Sir Roger had opinions about. Douglas Murray is a writer, full stop. I think that describes him best. And I've found in reading some of his work that when he has the time to do it at full length, or when he gives himself the time to do it at full length, he's a very fine journalist. I think his book on the Troubles, some of the Troubles later in Ireland, demonstrates that. It's one of the lesser sung of your books, but it's beautifully written, and I thank you for that. He's a graduate of Eton College and of Oxford, and I think a very fine example of what an emphasis on free inquiry can produce when it's brought into politics, polemics, clear defense of positions in the public sphere. Without further ado, I'd like to hand this over to Douglas Murray to deliver a lecture on the life and legacy of Sir Roger Scruton.
Well, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. I first met Sir Roger Scruton over 2 decades ago in a very unprepossessing office building in a very unprepossessing part of London. I'd finished my time at Oxford with not very much distinction, but with a book under my belt, a book which had both started my career and also stalled it. Because after leaving this place, I discovered to my great surprise a truth that all writers must at some point discover, which is that unless you keep working, the money doesn't keep coming in. I also wanted to pivot from literary writing to political writing. Facing the prospect of destitution, one of my great friends, the late president of Magdalen College, Oxford, Anthony Smith, proposed that I seek an internship at a small online magazine in London, where he had an in with an old left-wing comrade of his. For the princely sum of £50 a week, I made coffee and started writing my first political, not to say polemical, works. To my great good fortune, one of the other employees at the website was the wonderful Sophie Scruton. We became fast friends, and one day Roger, an occasional contributor, appeared in the office. I remember with great clarity the first impression that he made upon me. Because in an office full of surly people, all staring discontentedly into their computers, throwing themselves discontentedly at that day's discontents, Roger was sitting in the middle of the office, serenely, reading an old hardback, a work of 19th century philosophy. Like Sophie, he was an oasis in the middle of a troublesome office at a disputatious time. At some point, Roger realized that he and I were fellow travelers on several questions, and he started, I now realize, to guide me. In those days, about 2001 to 2, there were two people whose good opinion I especially sought. One was Roger, and the other was Christopher Hitchens. Getting the good opinion of both wasn't easy, since neither had an entirely good opinion of the other. But if Christopher drew me towards him through his panache and fervor, Roger drew me for other reasons. The first, as many people will know here, was his goodness. When you're starting your career, it's often practical advice that matters to you most. After a while, I recall Roger recommending to me another web publication which sought a certain number of articles a year for the even more princely sum of £1,500. I thought I was made. But it was Roger who said to me, "Douglas, treat it not as a payment for the articles, but as a down payment for the book you need to write." I followed the advice, and it worked. Another thing that drew me to him, apart from his encouragement and kindness, was a facet of him which was rare then and is rarer still now, which was that he was not content to play in the shallows of his time. He wanted to be engaged in events and thoughts at deeper and higher levels than his age seemed to permit. When people asked him about this or that minister or this or that government policy, he was often at his least comfortable. Though he always gave wiser counsel than most, this was not his pitch. Anyone who doubts that should try to listen to the event in which The Guardian once pitted him against Polly Toynbee. It can still be found somewhere online. Toynbee is trying to find any depths available to her by throwing out the ephemeral, while Roger is desperately trying to find a way to apply philosophy to ephemeral policies which Toynbee herself will have forgotten within the day. In any case, Roger is well known for his political philosophy, but today I want to talk about another aspect of his philosophy, something I regard as an even deeper aspect of his character and thought, and one which, in my view, everything else comes from. Because it seems to me that the thing that animated and dominated Roger's life as a thinker was his work on what lies beneath. Two particular things make me want to address this. The first is something that another much-missed friend once said to me, the late Chief Rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks. He was a student of Roger's at Cambridge University in the 1970s, and by Roger's own admission, one of his most brilliant students. Some years ago, I was trying to arrange an honor for Roger, since he had received none in his own land, despite being festooned with honors abroad. Of course, this campaign culminated in his receiving a knighthood, something which went some way, I think, to healing the wounds caused by years of dismissal and mistreatment in his home country. Anyway, part of the process of achieving an honor, a campaign which Roger had no knowledge of, was to go to the great and the good and collect letters of support for the application. With the help of friends like Jessica Douglas Hume, I managed to gather together a pretty wonderful list of letters. It was dominated by letters from former students of Roger's from the underground university. These were people who had been students of Roger's at the secret philosophy seminars he had run in upstairs rooms behind the Iron Curtain in the 1970s and 80s, trying to keep the candle of freedom and philosophy alive in Central and Eastern Europe, whilst communism was trying to snuff them out. It was tremendously moving to see how eager his former students in the underground university were to testify to this man's greatness. And even more impressive was how many of those who'd sat in those secret, dingy upstairs rooms in Prague, Budapest, and Warsaw had gone on to be among the first prime ministers and presidents of their countries when freedom came. Their testimonials were gold. So too was the letter of support from Sir Tom Stoppard, and that of Jonathan Sacks. And it was during this campaign when I called Jonathan to ask him for his letter, which he very swiftly sent, that Jonathan said something that's always stayed with me. He said, "Roger is bigger than the age." The same may be said, I have to say, of Jonathan Sacks as well. But it was a generous and typically accurate testament from his former student. Roger was indeed bigger than the age. You may say that that's because the age was shallow, an undeniable fact that I will return to later. But it was also because Roger was deep, as deep a thinker as could be, applying himself to all the great questions that have preoccupied philosophers from ancient Greece until now. But the other thing that moves me to address this aspect of what lay at the foundations of his philosophy is this. Towards the end of his life, Roger and I took the train to Cambridge and back to record a discussion between him and Jordan Peterson, chaired by the estimable Stephen Blackwood of Ralston College. On the way there and on the way back, Roger was recognized and stopped by a couple of young people, quite possibly, but not necessarily, students. Both independently said that they had discovered his work and philosophy through his documentary on beauty. Now, many of you will be aware of this documentary. It's generally available on YouTube, though sometimes taken down for copyright reasons. Catch it while you can. It generally comes back up in a version inexplicably with Portuguese subtitles. But no matter. The point is that this documentary and the accompanying book from Oxford University Press seemed to hit a popular mark in a way that philosophers very rarely do. And it's because in that documentary, Roger addressed a question which our age does not like to ponder, which it seems, in fact, disturbed by. That question is a fundamental one. What is beauty? What does it mean? What is it saying? In a recent dark moment, I took a leaf out of Roger's approach that day when we first met and decided that instead of doom scrolling through Twitter or Instagram, I should console myself by rereading a great work of philosophy. So, from the shelf of my apartment in New York, I plucked the collected Plato and decided to reread the Phaedo, Plato's account of the last hours in the life of Socrates. Perhaps this upcoming lecture was on my mind. Perhaps there was a reason why I wanted to remind myself of what a great philosopher who was most wrongly, unjustly accused and condemned might have been thinking about in his final days. That, too, is a matter I'll return to. But, as with all great works, on reading the Phaedo again, this time a question suddenly roared out at me that had passed me by before. What is it that the condemned Socrates decides to spend his final day on earth discussing with the friends in his cell? He talks about his life, he talks about life in general, about death, the potential immortality of the soul. He tries to console his friends and, of course, also scold them when they disappoint him. But what struck me this time was this. Why does Socrates spend his last hours, even his last minutes on earth, discoursing with his friends about beauty? In some ways, it's especially strange because Socrates' argument is one of causality. As he says, it seems to me that whatever else is beautiful apart from absolute beauty is beautiful because it partakes of that absolute beauty and for no other reason. At one point, Socrates concludes that while I hold fast to this, I cannot fall. It is safe for me or for anyone else to answer that it is by beauty that beautiful things are beautiful. The great German romantic Friedrich Hölderlin picks up Socrates' wider thought on this in his great poem Socrates und Alcibiades, that begins, Warum, heiliger Socrates. In that poem, Hölderlin has Socrates being asked why a man of his learning should waste any time looking at a beautiful person. And Socrates' response to this, it's a sort of castigation of him. Why wouldn't you be contemplating higher things? Socrates' reply, here in a very rough English version, is, who most deeply inquires, loves what is liveliest, and true virtue perceives who has observed the world. And at moments, the sages must be yielding to beauty itself. Benjamin Britten, in his setting of this poem, in his Hölderlin Fragments, perfectly paints both the question and the answer. The question searches desperately for a key to arrive on. Yet not only does it miss a home key, the voice and piano seem to be talking past one another. It's as though they cannot meet and can never find a key of agreement. But the moment that Socrates' answer begins, the piano begins the devastatingly simple growth of a D major chord. From there, all is into safe harbor. It's as though after the tempest of the question, the answer was sitting there waiting in perfect harmony all along. There the question seems to have remained for some centuries, indeed millennia. Aquinas doesn't get us very much further when he famously defines beauty as that which, when seen, pleases. It isn't actually very helpful, despite his follow-on recognition that the properties of integrity, proportion, and clarity help make clear that thing when seen. But of course, it's Roger's great hero, Immanuel Kant, who takes us another step further. For Kant, of course, believed that certain things transcend our understanding. God may well be one of them. So was the transcendental in general. As he says, the only way to understand the transcendental is to flip them from theoretical to practical reason, to recognize that we are wrong to think that we can have knowledge about the transcendental, but right to think that when we reach this limit, there is still somewhere else to go. We should step sideways, as it were, recognize that reason does not merely describe the world, but also commands us to change it. And really, the invocation of the transcendental is a reminder that reason knows the world in another way, as a sphere of action in which we can freely change the way things are. This was at the heart of Roger's own understanding of aesthetics and the question of beauty, that it speaks of something whereof we cannot speak, but which we look to and yearn for. And that yearning tells us something. And that something may in fact be the thing. It may in fact be the key to everything. One of my favorite essays of Roger's is Effing the Ineffable, in which he grapples with this very problem about the limits of knowledge. It's in the volume Confessions of a Heretic I was pleased to write a new introduction to a couple of years ago. In that gem of an essay, Roger writes about the moments when we seem to encounter the utterly beautiful or the ineffable. In particular, the feeling we get when we get to the limits of understanding that Kant describes. Among the examples he gives are the moment of recognition that may come while listening to Fauré's F-sharp ballad, seeing the smile on the face of the Mona Lisa, or watching the evening sunlight on the hill behind the house. Roger writes, anybody who goes through life with open mind and open heart will encounter these moments of revelation, moments that are saturated with meaning, but whose meaning cannot be put into words. These moments are precious to us. When they occur, it is as though on the winding, ill-lit stairway of our life, we suddenly come across a window through which we catch sight of another, brighter world, a world to which we belong, but which we cannot enter. A world to which we belong, but which we cannot enter. This seems to me one of the best descriptions we have, not just of the ineffable, but of the beautiful, and indeed the divine. When I was younger and much more callow, I sometimes thought that Roger ducked the question of God. I sometimes talked about this with him in private because I knew it was something he was loath to discuss in public. Like many true philosophers, he didn't like to get pinned down precisely on the question. Philosophers are, by their nature, skeptics, and skeptics, of course, tend towards the atheistic. there was also the question of whether Roger pretended to believe a little more than he did in order not to let down an audience who he felt it part of his duty not to disappoint. This was a question that I often pondered when I attended Garston Parish Church with Roger and listened to the local vicar trying to give a sermon whilst Roger's huge cranium poked above the top of the curtain in the organ loft where he played with each service. It was a terrible job for the vicar. I suppose I especially came to this view that Roger was avoiding the core subject because whenever I read a new book of Roger's that was meant to be about God, such as The Soul of the World, Our Church, and especially his Gifford lectures that came out as The Face of God, I often came away feeling that Roger had addressed everything apart from God. Usually these books addressed liturgy, literature, philosophy, aesthetics, music, the countryside, and always, of course, architecture. He's ducking it, my callow younger self sometimes thought, and to my shame occasionally said. And yet, the longer I've thought about Roger's work and thought, the more it has seemed to me that he was doing anything but duck the question. In fact, he was getting as close to it as it was possible to get, as close as it is possible for any of us to get. Architecture, the countryside, belonging, home, beauty, these were all gateways to God, perhaps the only gateways we have. Short of revelation, the beautiful is the best chance we have to approach the divine. He saw that beauty might be the best chance on earth to see something of God's face. We might see it in the facade of a beautiful building, the music of Mozart, the sunlight on the garden. But there's another way to approach this question, which is to turn it around. In this version, we might say that it's not our place to judge beauty, because in fact, it may be more accurate to say that it is beauty that judges us. That's the view, among others, that Rilke takes. It is that the beautiful object, indeed even the beautiful person, is not just beautiful, but is telling us something. And it's telling us something through the medium of beauty. Rilke addresses this most famously in his sonnet on the archaic torso of Apollo. Standing before that statue, Rilke has the feeling of bereftness, which can often come from seeing something utterly beautiful and not knowing what to do about it. A feeling that comes like bereavement. I know this thing is in front of me. I know that it is in some way challenging me, and I feel I need to do something or say something to react to it, even just to accept it. The genius of Rilke is that he gives the words that need saying not to the observer, but to the observed, not to the viewer, but to the archaic torso itself. And it's not just a suggestion, it is a demand, a command. In fact, it's a reprimand. And it's a pretty fearsome one at that. Because as you know, the final line of Rilke's sonnet on the torso comes from the torso of Apollo himself, who says to the man gazing at it, "Du musst dein Leben ändern." You must change your life. And there's something in that also returns me to Roger's thought. Because if this is one of the challenges that beauty makes to us, then it explains, among other things, why our age is so opposed to it. Standing in a magnificent building like this one, having driven past the wastelands of Oxford new builds, I can't be the only person who looks around here and thinks, why don't we just do more of this? Yet, of course, the increasing absence of beauty in a culture what it creates and what it leaves behind, tells us everything about that culture, more than the speech of any minister. For a culture which moves away from beauty can move away from it at an increasing speed. And that's because we do indeed judge ourselves, knowingly or otherwise, by our distance from a recognized ideal. And every step that we take away from that ideal is a further reprimand to the place we find ourselves in. Knowingly or otherwise, we judge ourselves by the distance we find ourselves from beauty. The further away from beauty we are, the more beauty itself, when seen, seems to castigate us. Why are you not doing this? It says. Why do you not do this? What are you doing? The further away from beauty we are, the more likely we are to turn on it, pretend we don't need it or know it, and the more we try to do without it. People often think that people like beautiful people who are beautiful either on the inside or out. It's not so in my observation. They're just as likely to dislike and even hate them. After all, the worse you feel about yourself, the more that you feel that you are far away from any beautiful ideal, the more you might hate the person that's beautiful, inside or out. Some of you may have noticed that beautiful women are often disliked by other women. Beautiful men are often disliked by other men. Beautiful women often disliked by not beautiful women, and vice versa. It's the same with goodness. The further away you wander from a life you believe is good, the easier it is to dislike someone who's following that path. Just as the further you are from the life you hoped to live, the more you may resent the person living the life you missed. Because the judgment, like the judgment of beauty, falls not on the other person, but falls on you. It's the same, I would suggest, with the presence of people interested in the depths and heights of human thought and culture in an age content to wallow in the shallows. The more that a person is dedicated to the pursuit of higher things, the more they will find themselves in a shallow age, lampooned, ridiculed, and even hated by people who no longer aspire to get there, and as a result, dislike those people who are still aiming high. I remember when Roger's documentary on beauty came out, and I may be the only person alive who still remembers this, an exceptionally bitter art critic in one of the major newspapers used the opportunity not to review the program, but to attack Roger. Not for any of the contents of the program or of his book, a book I suspect the critic couldn't have read, brief though it is. Rather, he chose to attack Roger for his looks, certain of his political attitudes, his hair color, and even the alleged scrufulousness of his surname. I won't name this critic. Suffice to say, his own name and visage leave much to be desired. But this brings me to a separate point that I want to make, and which I should like to make as I start to wind towards my conclusion, and winding it will be. It's this. The treatment of Roger in the last year of his life is something that some of us have a very hard time forgetting or forgiving, any more than I imagine that certain of the pupils of Socrates found it easy to settle with comfort on their city's decision to destroy their teacher. By the last year of his life, Roger had finally been not just honored in his own country, but given a position by a conservative government to advise on this most pressing of issues, how to try to build beautiful housing in a country desperately in need of housing, and even more desperately in need, as we see everywhere, of beautiful housing. Roger was engaged in his researches, when a young snake of a man came to interview him, misrepresented what he'd said, lied about him, and then attempted with his editor to cover up those lies. The fact that the magazine in question had been one Roger contributed to for many years didn't make the pill any easier to swallow. Roger was accused falsely of almost every one of the modern heresies, including racism, especially, strangely, racism against the Chinese. It was preposterous, a preposterous set of allegations, and several of us knew immediately that this was the case from the outset. Yet the conservative government of the day, led by that great lady of principle, Theresa May, sacked Sir Roger before they had even seen any more than a couple of tweets from the lying reporter. Conservative MPs and ministers declared it a no-brainer to fire Sir Roger and declared that Scruton was just so much dead weight on their party. Meanwhile, the spokesperson for Labour's front bench, one Andrew Gwynn, declared that, quote, "Nobody holding Scruton's views has a place in modern democracy." So not only did Roger not have the right to a job, career, or reputation, nor should he merely not have the right to speak, he had no place, and not just in his home country, but in any modern democracy. As I mentioned at the time, I supposed that this meant that in future, if we needed views on Hegel, Kant, or Spinoza, we would have to raid the mind of Andrew Gwynn. Now, incidentally, earlier this year, Mr. Gwynn gave an interview in which he talked about his recent depression and how he had suffered recently from a feeling that he had, quote, "absolutely nothing going for me." Although he happily now says that he has got his life back, and good for him, I say, I do wonder if he ever wondered about the well-being or mental health that people as wholly ignorant as him seem willing to trample on every day in our society with their lies, and whether perhaps his feelings of worthlessness are not in fact telling him something he should listen to, such as, "You should change your life." As some people here know, I fought a campaign to get Roger's reputation back. In fact, I think I dedicated every hour of every day for some months to that campaign. I eventually got hold of a copy of the tape of the interview that the New Statesman refused to hand over, and this proved beyond any doubt that the reason they had previously refused to hand over the tape of the interview was because the account of the interview that the magazine had printed was a lie from beginning to end. The quotes attributed to Roger were fabricated. Still, I can't believe, by the way, that everybody involved in that magazine has held on to their jobs, but let me pass that over. Roger was vindicated, but I remember that even at this point of victory, it felt like too little a victory. Roger called me immediately after I published the true account of what had happened and said to me, "So do you think I still have a career?" There haven't been many times in my life when I've wanted to cry with frustration, but that was one of them. How is it possible that our greatest philosopher had been brought low by such fabricators? How is it possible that a mind of such breadths and depths should have been all but destroyed by people so totally unworthy of him? And what did it say about our era that it was willing to play along with this game, to discard people with such glee, to dispense with such talent, with such eagerness? To this day, I don't know. The last time Roger appeared on the radio after his vindication, his interviewer did the same media trick. A set of "so what you're saying is" questions at him, tried to trip him up with past quotes, quoted him out of context, and tried to defame him afresh. Despite being vindicated, the shallows of the era kept trying to reassert themselves. And then, of course, it ended. The worries that had dominated Roger's final months, the sleeplessness and the toll that all this took on him, turned out to cover the fact that he was suffering from cancer. The wonderful conversation we had after his vindication before an audience in London for The Spectator turned out to be his last. He was dead within half a year. My main memory of his funeral is not just of the service, but of the number of young people wandering around Malmesbury that day with books in their hands. I do not want to end on a bitter note, but I do want to end on a question. Can a society really survive, let alone do anything good or beautiful, if it is so willing to play these dirty, nasty games? Can any society seriously manage to do anything good if it is willing to throw away and discard people on provable hearsay? Can we get anywhere, let alone create anything, if we throw away our most talented people with such ease? Can we honestly do anything of worth if people kicking their feet in the shallows continue to try to drown everyone else in their puddles? It's not a straightforward question, but it's one which we would do very well to think upon. Of course, like all great questions, it's one that people have thought on before. I haven't had time to talk about the art of theatre this evening, but theatre is one of the places, like the other arts and philosophy, that our species goes to in order to try to discover beauty, to try to understand itself, to try to discover itself, to listen to beauty and to try, as Roger wrote, to F the ineffable. In 1973, Laurence Olivier appeared on the Dick Cavett Show to discuss, among other things, the opening of this country's National Theatre. He also recited a Shakespeare sonnet. And if anyone thinks that television chat shows haven't dumbed down in recent years, watch that interview. But the part of the interview that I find most moving is this part, in which Olivier says, uninterrupted and with such easy eloquence, he's asked about the importance of theatre, and Olivier says, I think theatre is terribly important. I think that it is the initial glamorizer of thought. I think that through the art of the theatre can be told without too much disguise, but without too much directness either, the secrets and thereby its antipathies and sympathies, the secrets and the knowledge of the human heart. And I think that makes the art of theatre as important as the doctor or the psychologist or the minister even. I think it's vitally important that the world knows itself. And I think the theatre is one of the most immediate means of expression towards that end. I'd like to say two things in closing. The first is that I learned a lesson during the period in which I defended Sir Roger, and it's a lesson I should like to pass on, especially to the younger people present here tonight. Please always stand up for your friends, especially when they're right. There is every reason in the world to do so, but one is not obvious, although perhaps it should be. and it's this. It might be the only chance you get to show them how much they mean to you. If you don't seize this opportunity whenever it comes along, you'll have to save the truth of your feelings for their funeral or obituaries. It's not much use to anyone then. But if you defend a friend while they're alive, you might just give them the slightest intimation of how much you value them and love them, and how much other people love them too. But I want also to say one final thing. In an era of cancellation and defenestration, we sometimes forget that we cannot go on like this, and also that we've been here before. We know this because our greatest writers and artists have addressed this question in their own times. When Roger was going through his own battle with the Shallows, I often thought of Shakespeare's rarely performed but great play, Timon of Athens. Timon has the whole world before him. He's surrounded by friends and admirers. He's been generous to all. Yet he falls on hard times in the city. And when he does, absolutely everyone deserts him. He's left with nothing and nobody, and risks being filled with despair and rage. It doesn't help that he's shadowed by the cynical philosopher Epaminondas, who has warned him that just such a desertion might one day occur. I adore this scene and should like in closing to read it, but I'm not a professional actor, so I'd like to invite someone to the stage who is. The former Cameron Mackintosh Professor of Contemporary Theatre here at Oxford, one of the great actors of his generation, somebody I'm very proud to call a friend, Kevin Spacey.
Why dost thou seek me out? Why dost thou seek me out, Epaminondas? Thou art a fool, whom fortune's tender arm with favor never clasped, but bred a dog, a mangy dog. Hadst thou, like us, from our first swath, proceeded in the sweet degrees that this brief world affords, to such as may the passive drugs of it freely commend, thou wouldst have plunged thyself in general riot, melted down thy youth in different beds of lust, and never learned the icy precepts of respect, but followed the sugared game before thee. But myself, who had the world as my confectionery, the world, the mouths, the tongues, the eyes, and the hearts of men at duty more than I could frame employment, that numberless upon me stuck as the leaves do on the oak, and have with one winter's brush fallen from their boughs and left me open, naked for every storm that blows. I, to bear this that never knew but better, is some burthen, a burthen thy nature did commence in sufferance. Why shouldst thou hate men? They never flattered thee, used thee, deceived thee. What hast thou given? What hast thou ever given? Hence be gone, gone! If thou hadst not been born the worst of men, thou hadst been born a knave and flatterer. What wouldst thou do with the world, Appomattus, if it lay in thy power? Wouldst thou see thyself fall in the confusion of men and remain a beast with the beasts? A beastly ambition that the gods do grant thee to attain to. If thou were the lion, the fox would beguile thee. If thou were a lamb, the fox would eat thee. If thou were the fox, the lion would suspect thee when, perchance, thou hadst been accused by the ass. And were thou the ass, thou wouldst be tormented by thy dullness. And still thou livest as a breakfast to the wolf. And wert thou a wolf, thy greediness would afflict thee, and oft thou shouldst hazard thy life for thy dinner. Wert thou a unicorn, pride and wrath would confound thee, and oft thou shouldst hazard thy life for thy dinner. Wert thou a bear, thou wouldst be killed by the horse. Were thou a horse, thou wouldst be seized by the leopard. Were thou a leopard that were germane to the lion, all the spots of thy kindred would serve as jurors on thy life. Jurors on thy life. And all thy safety were emotion, and all thy defense absence. What beast couldst thou be that were not subject to a beast? And what a beast thou art already, that seest not thy loss in transformation. Away, thou issue of a mangy dog, away, thou tedious fool, beast, toad, rogue, rogue, rogue. I am sick of this false world and will love it not.
Spoke a lot about the transcendentals, beginning with beauty, moving toward goodness. Truth came up eventually. But unity is the one that's missed typically, isn't it? Oh, sorry. There's a philosopher on my left, sorry. But unity is the one that's missing, isn't it, typically? And it's the hardest to...
Yeah, just to think about Roger for a moment and to say, Sophie, it's great to see you. And I mean, the thing with Roger, my memory, you know, he wrote, the reason we met was that he wrote me a letter. And when I became a lord, he wrote me a letter and he said, I'd really like to meet and I've got an urgent question to ask you. And I replied, yeah, I'd really like to meet and I've got an urgent question to ask you as well. So we met and his urgent question was, how comes you're a lord and I'm not? You know, so difficult to answer. I said easier to answer for a conservative. I thought, you know, whim, chance, contingency, just the way it goes. Well, I said, but maybe it says more about my party than it says about yours. And my question to him was, how can you be a conservative and not really have any critical words to say about capitalism? You know, this is what I don't understand. And that was how and the reason this answers your question is that maybe, Douglas, I'd like to hear what you think, but there was a gentleness to him, a real gentleness, and a real openness to talk to anybody. I mean, in that sense, the analogy with Socrates is absolutely pertinent. I mean, the fact that he had a reasonable conversation with my son is a tribute beyond measure in lots of ways, and he wasn't goaded, and that's what made that end story with the New Statesman so tragic, and maybe because of his lifelong sort of relationship with his dad. Roger's dad was Jeremy Corbyn ×3. You know, it looked like him, spoke like him, and believed in and he had a beautiful measure. So I think the aspect of unity that he was looking for, well, there was one aspect which was about sovereignty and political loyalty. That's one thing that I think he wrote very well on. But the other one was the possibility of a civic discourse or a civil discourse with people who disagreed with you. That was the essence of this polity, this England that he had, was that he wasn't looking for a uniformity of view. He wasn't looking for homogeneity. I mean, in that sense, Douglas, he was perfectly inappropriate for his time. I mean, we could say that he was searching for a meaningful conversation with whoever would have it with him. And maybe that's the reason he never got the peerage. Yeah.
Goodness, it's true. My interactions with Roger began in 2003 when I had a summer program here at Oriel College and proceeded to work with him in a number of places. Actually, we met through him, actually, in the Netherlands for some projects he was doing to help bring some of his ideas abroad and let some of the Europeans know they weren't as alone as they thought they were in some of their political battles. There's a German, Dutch, a Germanic word, consequent, and this relates to unity. And I found him to be quite thoroughgoing, and you wouldn't find him saying one thing about one area of human endeavor or about something that's true here that wouldn't then show up and be applied elsewhere. And so when you find the gentleness, was it Wittgenstein who said it's philosophy scarcely can be done slowly enough?
Yeah.
The gentleness also meant that some of the hesitations about questions of God were also a function of the fact that he'd only been thinking about it by that point for 70-ish years. And it's the kind of question that can scarcely be treated slowly enough as a philosophical question. Maybe beauty, where you started, is what I wanted to ask, what you might have thought, Douglas. I tended in conversations with him toward the end of his life, when he went back to beauty, to get a sense that he was using beauty to intimate more and more toward arguments for the existence of God. But these intimations for rather than arguments for. Did that, I mean, if they were very private conversations, I'm not asking for revelations, but did you find beauty was typically the direct route that he was still beginning with and arguing toward the transcendental and eventually toward?
I think so. I think that passage I quoted from Effing, the ineffable, that's what he's saying. That's the closest you can get, short of divine revelation, that you have to treat these moments of transcendence, of beauty, as being a signal to you. They're saying something, they're speaking to you. And this is clearly how he saw it, as a kind of a flare on your path in life, that you might come across a ballade by Fauré, and that's telling you something. And then that it isn't to be ignored. You've got to try to work out what it was saying and why it was saying it. Why it was saying it to you, even. Why it says it to lots of people. But just to go back to your earlier point, by the way, I would just say that one of the funny things, wherever you went in the world with Roger, as everyone present who knows him knows, he would have pupils everywhere. Often he would call them the refugees from the academy. And the most extraordinary things, I mean, I remember once we were meeting somewhere in the Netherlands or Belgium or something, and it turned out he'd come in a day earlier because there was a student in great distress somewhere in Belgium who had not at all found his home in the university and the faculty he was in. He had nobody around who was listening, and he had written to Roger. They'd got into conversation. Roger had gone to see him and to try to counsel him, and that's why he'd gone a day earlier to Belgium. This is a sacrifice we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't like somebody saying, could you come and see me early in Venice? And that happened all the time. All the time. It happened particularly after his death. People came out of the woodwork and said, oh, I was one of his students. You'd say, where? Well, in that he would, whenever I had a question about something, he would answer it. And if I had a query, he would be there. It's a very unusual thing.
He was a very, very unusual man, and obviously I miss him. I miss him a lot, and I think, I don't know how, there's often I find myself reaching to contact him still.
Yes.
And talk, and I found that the best way of thinking about him is that he was an extremely paradoxical man. I mean, for a start, for a conservative philosopher to make Immanuel Kant the starting point, who's the founder of a rights-based liberalism, is very strange. And the fact that he finds in Kant the image of God and the transcendent and the possibilities of engaging with that kind of transcendent beauty is, just to let you know, very unusual take in an extremely logical system of mutually constraining rights. That's odd. What I'm saying is that's very odd. The other thing is that with the gentleness was an enormous courage, a very quiet courage, I think a very English form of courage. Yes. I mean, strangely, he became, after we met, it was very, very odd experience, knowing him. He'd say, oh, I'm thinking of writing a book, and I'd say, that old Private Eye cartoon, I'm part of that, Peter Cook, one guy who looks a bit like me speaking to another guy who looks a bit like him, and he says, I'm writing a book, and the other guy says, neither am I. That's how I live my life. He said, I'm writing a book. I said, oh yeah, so am I. And then 6 months later, I'd see him, and he'd finished it.
Yes,
do you know that one?
I used to say that one could almost have a social life just by going to Roger's book launches.
Yeah, well,
There was enough parties in the year.
It was more active than mine. I used to skip them. So, so a conservative who really loved Immanuel Kant is a very strange thing. That gentleness combined with, and in a way, he did have just a truth instinct to go to this truth, which meant he was, he was a good man and he tried to be a good man, but he was always going to get into trouble. I mean, always, because he couldn't help but say that truthful thing that would disturb the fake homogeneity of thought.
Well, that's the difference between philosophy and politics, isn't it?
Yes.
The politician has to stop just before being able to say the unutterable truth, and the philosopher must say it.
Exactly. And so in that sense, I was disgusted and appalled, but not surprised by the fact that when he finally got a political position, it would be taken from him. It seemed to fit that distinction.
By the way, I may make just one observation on that as well. One of the interesting things throughout his life was that even before the last perhaps 10 years when he was most well known, wherever I went abroad, in America, across the continent, almost anywhere, whenever I complained about the situation in my own country, whoever I was speaking to, if they were a Conservative, would say, "But you have Roger Scruton." And I would say, yes, and I don't take him for granted, but on his own, it's not enough. We have to have other people in the society and possibly in government. But it was always so moving, the way that people from abroad, they would say, "But you have Roger."
Yeah, and in that sense, there was an aspect where he was very much on his own. He didn't build a political position. He didn't build those political alliances. I mean, he's not present when I'm in Parliament. His spirit is not present in the contemporary Conservative Party, I feel.
Which is, of course, an indictment on the current Conservative Party, not on Roger.
But it's long-lasting. That's what I'm saying. This has been going on for... I mean, he never got selected for a seat when he tried. He couldn't even get selected to be on a European.
Although, do you know that story of, Sophie remembered, I remember Roger once recounting the story that he was, I think it's in one of the books, possibly News from Somewhere, where he's canvassing loyally for the Conservative Party in the 2000s for some local election, and he's some council estate, I seem to remember, that there was a sort of door-to-door and, leafleting and it's a rather benighted estate, post-war estate, and he said he knocks on this particular door and says, "I wonder, madam, if I can interest you in voting for the Conservative cause on Thursday week." And the woman says, "What is conservatism anyway?" And Roger says, "Well, that's a very interesting question."
Could I push us back to some of the meat of your talk, especially on aesthetics? You tacked in that direction. It's been spoken about as shorts of revelation, as transcendental. I want to appeal to Arnold very quickly, and then Arnold on freedom. It's a good horse to ride, but it needs to be ridden somewhere. And beauty would seem to admit of the same sort of analysis. On the other hand, we speak of beauty, and Roger would often speak of it. Some of us were present for one of these meetings in Belgium, where we spoke about the set of poems by Rilke that you appealed to, and he would speak of it at times as an end in itself. But of course, transcendentals aren't, strictly speaking, ends in themselves. They're to be written somewhere. Do you have a sense where, if this question were posed to Roger, or of the body of work that falls under Scruton? And part of what I want to ask eventually is, the memorial lectures are Sir Roger Scruton Memorial Lectures, but if his thought is going to persist, it will persist not as Roger, but as Scruton.
Oh, yeah.
And so asking which bits of it we should really ask persons in this room and ask others to focus on making part of the corpus, I think, is a question I'd like to have answered before we're done. But this question of where to ride beauty to, or if that's the wrong question, perhaps, but...
Well, I would, first of all, certainly in my conversation, let alone the reading, there's something about music. There's something about music through which you can apprehend the sublime more than any other form of the arts. I mean, it used to, and then the glimpses of the face of God was from home. I mean, it was the oikophilia. That was maybe his most important philosophical move, was to restore the necessity of the enchantment of the mundane.
Yes.
That's another paradox, I guess, that it was most sublime when it was most intimate and home-like, although I'm aware, Sophie, that used to come down to London a lot and not quite linger as long as he may have in his home. These were all parts of the paradox of him, but that oikophilia and that home, it's, when he used to say to me a lot, he says, you're lucky. He said, you're Jewish, imagine trying to find it when you're Anglican, he used to say to me. And try to find it, he did, and he tried to find it in the choral music. He tried to find it in sort of moments and fragments of the divine in the village. But I would say that those two things, home, the idea of home, and then music. And it wasn't simply, I mean, he was kind of really brilliant with the American Songbook,
Yes.
with Gershwin, with Rogers, and with that form. I thought he played it beautifully, and was yearning for that. He saw that in that, so that it wasn't simply the very high. There was a popular glimpse of it in that form between, let's say, 1930 and 1956, roughly, just to give it the period of time where it became disenchanted then and not beautiful. You know, the difference between maybe Somewhere Over a Rainbow and Eleanor Rigby, if you can understand the difference between those two, you'd go a long way to see Roger's sense of the sublime.
Yeah. By the way, your description of how he sort of was at odds with the Conservative Party is interesting looking back, because it was one of those misunderstandings that some people had, because, of course, The Meaning of Conservatism came out in 1980, just after Margaret Thatcher comes into office. And some of you will know that quite often books get attributed a weight they don't actually expect or expect to carry, and are given a meaning that was not meant by the author. And I think that's the case with The Meaning of Conservatism. It isn't by any means a primer for the Thatcher government. In fact, as you know, Maurice, I mean, it's significantly at odds with a lot of the things that Thatcher does, and therein lies this difficulty in the 1980s and 90s that Roger has, which is that Thatcherism, of course, does all sorts of things that are beneficial to the country, and yet it disturbs an aspect of that issue of home.
It really did.
And therein lies one of Roger's tensions.
Deeper, let's go, is that capitalism itself, I mean, I'm just sharing with everybody what we spoke about more than any other thing, tries to turn the most sublime, which is the creation, the world, human beings and nature, that, you know, at the moment we're in the cycle just beginning. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, you know, those, and to turn that into a price system where everything is for sale is
commodification.
Commodification
The
is
places he was clearest on this was in sexual desire and places like that, the things that he wanted to withhold wholly from the market.
Yeah, so that's where he had to engage with the sacred. What was it that was not for sale? What was it that could not be pursued in that way? And I think that he was in the most sublime phase in those later years when he was really engaging with that, certainly. So that's where I would say that combination of conservatism and socialism is not entirely alien to this space.
By the way, I'd say one other thing on music, if I may, which is that apart from, is it Goethe who says that music speaks of itself? I can't remember, I'm getting a bad misquote. But the interesting thing about music, of course, is that you're able to locate home in music by its very nature, in that the chord, the scale will go to its natural place. The chord will reach its resolution. Music comes home in a way that almost no other art form does, so that even if it takes 4 hours or 5 hours in a Wagner opera, by the end of something like Meistersinger, you finally get the conclusion, or after the end of the whole of the Ring cycle, Siegfried's Funeral March finally gives you the culmination of something you heard 16 hours earlier at the beginning of Rheingold. And the point is that it is the returning home of the theme and the final completion of it.
To the root.
To the root.
Actually, yeah.
And it's very hard to think of another art form where that is so
demanded.
clear.
It's demanded.
It's demanded.
It's demanded of the form. Yeah, so I think that's really, you know, if you want to talk about where it goes now in terms of Scrutinism, that combination of home music and the sublime is probably not a bad way of organising the lectures.
The question you asked about can a society, toward the end, can a society survive when it has such disregard, when it disregards someone of such great talent on the basis of hearsay? This is an ugly thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah, I hope I gave that impression.
No. I mean, your description of it was much less ugly than the thing itself, but it's an ugly thing, and the aesthetics of the morality that involves revulsion at something that we should be revolted by, and moves from there to understand a judgment as asking me to change, is an excellent starting point. But if you are in a society that becomes, I think you described it early on, you spoke of that we're in a society that's quite shallow. I wonder whether the lesson can be learned. I worry that the lesson won't be learned.
Well, it must be learned, and it'll be learned from, for many people, from getting to know Roger Scruton's work. Because the thing that made him stand out, I think, among his generation of philosophers and conservatives was precisely that so many others found much of what he wrote about so unusual. Why is this man not writing about who the housing minister should be, or which particular way the party should be whipped on a particular vote? Why is he writing about opera? Why is he writing about architecture and particular types of columns, rather than just churning out newspaper columns? This was a mysterious project to many people on the right and also on the left. And I would say that the reason why Roger's legacy will live on for such a long time and is so needed now, and his name is alive now even more than perhaps than when he was alive, is because he offers that vision after you've seen through the era. You know, many people can critique the era, and there's much to critique. But to do that second thing of saying, and this is what you might do, it's a highly unusual thing in our era. I mean, the conservatives, to the extent that they think, tend to say, we will try to arrange the market in a way that is beneficial to you, and then do what you like. The left has its own answers to lots of things, and also gives points of purpose, including, of course, struggle and protest and much more. But a movement that simply critiques and then says, then the thing is open to you and just do what you will, is itself a shallow movement. Mm. And that's where Roger's thought and his legacy and his opus of books comes in. And like Maurice, sometimes when I think, I wonder what Roger would have thought, I have the great good fortune that we all have of being able to reach out and pluck him off my shelf.
It's beautiful, but what I would take issue with is that it's not enough to say that the time they lived in or the time that we live in is superficial, because the rage, the passion runs deep. It's a very superficial...
It's a superficial passion, though.
But the intensity, and I think you know, the sense of loss. Okay, so Roger spoke about, so with the home, the whole thing that he was arguing really was that every great, including the Bible, every great work involved leaving home and returning home. Yes. So an exile and a return. So that was fundamental, and it involved dealing with loss, estrangement, isolation, all the things that Kevin was expressing are part of that. In every lifetime there is an abandonment, there is a sense of intense loneliness, and the return is transforming, right? So one way of understanding why the age is very superficial in its forms of self-understanding, but not superficial in the intensity of its feeling.
Yes.
Is what I'm driving at. And Roger gives us some space to understand. So you can talk to people who have no conception whatsoever of God, and yet who think that the environment is sacred.
Yes.
And if you say to them, well, why do you think it's sacred? Shut up, it is, all right? Or my commitment to the equality of all human beings. But there's no willingness then to engage in any mutual conversation about how you could, maybe work together on this, because...
Although isn't it interesting that Roger's views on house building appear to have been picked up by Keir Starmer?
Well, I would say it's not. This makes a lot of sense because, that era of absolute polarization is, I think, over. Some notion can be shared. I mean, that was just to share with people, that was the conversation. I said to him, look, I'm much, much too conservative to ever be a member of the Conservative Party. You're just a bunch of Maoist market fanatics who want people to live as far away from their mum as they could possibly live and not write to her, and he used to say, so true, and that was the engagement.
There's an unconfirmed rumor, if I jump in now, that he said he might just be Blue Labour. Is that true?
He said that publicly. If you listen to the Confessions with Giles Fraser, when he was asked at the end what his politics were, he said, well, I identify with Blue Labour. Now, part of that is because within the Blue Labour group, we gave Roger a home. That's what made the tragedy with the New Statesman even more intense, because we had a series of seminars with John Cruddas in Parliament about conservatism and Labour. I mean, he's a really scary guy, You'd say, okay, let's have a discussion next week, we'll talk about Orwell and that form of English socialism related to Orwell. And Roger came in with his collected works and say, apologies, I'm only halfway through.
No, I can cap that by a discussion once at our late friend Shusha Gappi's, where a group of people, somebody asked Roger in the mid-2000s if he was going to do a new edition of his book, The West and the Rest, which came out after 9/11. And I remember Roger saying, I just don't think I can. My Farsi's not up to it anymore. And it was completely seriously said, and everybody else in the room looked like they just wanted to give up.
That's worth picking up on because, all those things he was accused of Islamophobia. I mean, his intense and deep knowledge of Islamic scripture was really something to behold. But to go to this point, and the reason why Roger's thought will be absolutely, I think, foundational moving forward is because what Labour has to confront in a very fundamental level is its utter estrangement from its home, which was working class people, on the whole Christian, building a home in the world against the dispossession of capitalism, which basically enclosed them and kicked them and condemned them to a pauper's death. Now, this was something Roger could speak to really profoundly, was a restoration of home and of mutual concern. So, that's not an unconfirmed rumour.
We've used the word home a lot. We've used the word home a lot, but also ordinary life. And when I looked at some of your Blue Labour, the agenda of Blue Labour, it seems to me some of what's being described in terms of the church, the trade union, the local, the small enterprise, the family and whatnot. It's kind of what I would call life as of yesterday or a few days ago. And is that conservatism within Labour?
Well, that is the whole thing. That's I don't want this to become one of those terrible events which becomes left wing. That would,
don't worry. That
wouldn't. That wouldn't be true.
I'll stop
to
that.
Roger. That wouldn't be true to that. But the whole of the co-op movement, the funeral was an alternative to a pauper's grave. The housing was an alternative to slums, and it was all based on, that was the whole movement until the bloody Fabians came along. mucked it all up. And so, that's a long story, but for our Fabians, you get your Institute of Economic Affairs that thinks that human beings are just rational economic actors and give them the right sticks and carrots. I mean, what a way to talk to people like they're donkeys. They'll act in the right way. So what I'm saying is this, okay, to go to the point, the actual profound point you're making, human beings are social beings in need of relationship and institutions that enable them to flourish. That, I think, is maybe an aspect of the eternal truth that Roger was driving at.
Defense of the person, defense of the person within encumbered communities, and with a limited. Maybe one of the differences between Scrutonian philosophy and the current philosophy of excess is there were very clear limits that he allowed to be set by nature, by culture, by relations, by a talent, by incidentals and accidentals of existence, which could be understood as providence or as just incidentals or accidents. But in the 3-ish minutes that we have remaining, I wanted to ask the question about Roger's legacy as Scruton, that is the deposit of writings and the thought that we hope will persist. Douglas, if you were to preserve 3 or 4 of these texts as absolutely essential, without which he'd be lost to the ages, what might they be? And they would be a short reading list for some of the persons in here who aren't familiar with.
Gosh, it's so difficult. Whenever I'm asked to recommend one book of Roger's, I always recommend his book on fox hunting.
Yeah.
Which I've discovered as a result, I've massively driven up the price of. And I wish I had a box of on hunting.
Yeah.
A copy somewhere in my.
I know someone who does.
Have you got a dealer for those? I desperately wish that I could find it. It would be like discovering gold bars in my. I think they're £500 a copy now. It's extremely hard to get hold of, but it's a wonderful book, and so delicately done. Talks about meeting his wife, talks about falling in love, talks about falling in love with hunting, talks about Heidegger, what he learns from riding a horse and how it makes sense of Heidegger, and has all of the quirks and thoughtfulness and interest and love that I think is him at his best. So hard to select from the other books. I mean, modern philosophy is wonderful to help you find your way through the swamp. And so that's a useful primer for a student. But I think I would go for some of the more positive books. His book on the aesthetics of music is going to remain important for a long time. And his memoirs. I mean, I'm a great lover of people's memoirs in general. And Gentle Regrets is one of the most beautiful.
Yeah, that's where I point people first, typically.
Yeah, I would go with that. I'd say definitely. I mean, also, it's great to see you, Jessica. There's a beautiful section in the fox hunting book about sitting with you at a certain moment of his life, which I think was quite close to the end times, where he felt utterly abandoned, apart from by you at that time. And that is beautifully done. I would say the book on Kant, the early book on Kant, it's got a lot to be commended. It's short.
He wrote it in a burst, didn't he? He wrote it in about a month.
He wrote it in a Hegelian burst, another paradox. Yeah. That book on Kant is beautiful. Then I would say one I pushed people towards is How to Be a Conservative, because really it could be rephrased of, how to be a reasonably civic human being in a hostile environment, which I think we could all do. I mean, I think it's very good like that. Just
It's a civilizing book.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, so I think that I'd go with Kant, fox hunting, How to Be a Conservative. If you want to make a top 3 Amazon reading list, I'd
buy shares in all of them.
I'll go that way.
Before we give Douglas Murray and Maurice our praise for having given us this hour and a half of their time, and also Mr. Spacey. I don't know if he's still with us for his performance. I wanted to say that on Wednesday of this week, there's the second of the Scruton Lectures, and that's with Alexander Stoddart, who is perhaps one of. No one has met him and forgotten having done so. That's maybe the best way to say it. And he does a knockdown, drag out
I think you were going to say no one has met him.
No one has met him.
And then
no one has met him.
But we're hoping he shows up.
About it, but he'll be here. It should be an excellent event, and he's a wonderful sculptor. And he did a bust of Roger with the Roman U in it, and Scruton, for what the Hall of Living Philosophers, etc. But it didn't end up there. But there are some floating about, and he does things on the heroic scale, right? The heroic scale. So come out and hear him speak Wednesday, same time, same place. Tickets are free, but you need to be ticketed through Eventbrite. That having been said, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your memories.
I wanted to thank you. So thank you.